Have you ever asked yourself what it actually feels like to have it all, and yet feel utterly empty within? What occurs when a man who has the world in his hands comes to see, all of a sudden, that there is something money cannot purchase, peace within the hearts of the very people he cares for most? Charles Bennett had built an empire from scratch, a man of power, wealth, and prestige, residing in a house so magnificent it was almost too much to touch. But behind those sleek doors and marble floors lay a silence so dense it had the power to shatter your soul. For all his success, Charles was unable to stop the one thing that altered everything: the day that his wife was gone, and with her, the laughter, the warmth, and the heartbeat of his family. What remained? Two small children, twins, 5 years old, innocent, and devastated by a loss they couldn't comprehend. Each evening, Charles attempted to keep their world afloat. He read them bedtime stories. He crooned lullabies, although his voice cracked on each note. He stayed at their bedsides until dawn lightened the sky. But whatever he did, the sobbing wouldn't cease. The cries of mommy sliced through the night like tiny knives, and each noise reminded him that he couldn't repair it. Have you ever experienced that sort of powerlessness, when despite how tough you are, despite all that you accomplish, you can't fix the thing that is most important to you? Charles was all too familiar with that sensation. He could seal deals worth millions of dollars before breakfast, but he couldn't purchase his kids a single moment of tranquility, and that reality tormented him. It shattered him. Then on one night, in the darkness of his own desperation, Charles whispered a prayer, not loudly, not proudly, simply a soft, broken whisper from the heart of a father. God, send someone who can save them, save us. And in that simple prayer, offered in the darkness, something remarkable began to move. The next morning, she appeared in their lives. Her name was Grace. She did not come in with pomp and circumstance or guarantees, but with a quiet presence that was different from anyone who had walked through that door previously. Her eyes were something kind, steady, as if they could comprehend pain without words. And when she got down to meet Lily and Lucas, she didn't glance at their father first, or the money that enveloped her. She looked straight into the eyes of two broken little souls and said 6 words that would change everything. I'm here for you. From that point on, things started changing. Gradually, softly, like spring arriving at a frozen winter. For the first time in weeks, the twins had spoken to someone besides their father. Just a word or two, but enough to awaken something in Charles. Hope. Might this woman truly be the solution to his midnight prayer? But what went down that evening was not what anyone anticipated. Charles sat in his study, waiting for the weeping that always erupted after dark. But instead of tears, he heard something different, something he hadn't heard in months, something that brought him up short, a song, gentle, warm, bleeding through the corridors like light in darkness. And when he went to the twins' room, what he saw paralyzed him where he stood. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor between their beds, singing a lullaby that seemed like a prayer set to song. Her voice was infused with hope. Her words promised safety and love and angels keeping watch through the dark. And then she did something unimaginable, something that had Charles feeling his own soul split open. She took their small hands in hers, bent her head, and whispered a blessing. Not words, but a cry for peace, a vow of love. And within a few minutes, the twins, those restless morning children, slept peacefully. For the first time since their mother's death. Have you ever witnessed love so genuine that it makes you humble? That evening, Charles did. And in that silent room something shifted, not just for his kids, but for him. Because for all his wealth, for all his power, it wasn't wealth that cured his family. It was grace. Both the name of the woman who entered that door and the provision she introduced into their lives. Across the weeks that came after, laughter once again filled the corridors of that vast vacant house. The twins broke into smiles once more, their eyes shining with the purity of loss. And Charles, he discovered a lesson that so many of us miss in the hustle and bustle of life. What truly is important isn't what we create with our hands, but what we carry in our hearts. Sometimes the greatest miracles come quietly, through kindness, through presence, through a love that expects nothing in return. Tonight I'd like to tell you that story, not because it's sensational or full of surprise, but because it contains something more, a truth that resonates with each of us, that even when life feels shattered, No matter how lost we are stumbling through the night, light can seep back in, and sometimes it comes in the form of a stranger who turns out to be just what your heart had been searching for. So get comfortable. Let me take you into the life of a man who had it all, and yet, in one simple gesture of love, learned what really counts. This is the tale of Charles, his twins, and the nanny who gave hope back to their lives. Ever seen a man who possessed all the world could give: wealth, fame, achievement, and subsequently lost the one thing that made it all worthwhile? That was Charles. For years he was the embodiment of strength and drive, a self-made millionaire who conquered every peak life set in his path. His company prospered, his house sat like a castle atop the hill, and his life seemed idyllic. But all of that was shattered in a single devastating instant. The day his wife, his companion, his anchor, was gone. Her premature death left not only a quiet in the home, but a vacuum so profound it took with it every ounce of happiness that once occupied its halls. The silence that took the place of her laughter was the whispery, shaking voices of two small children, his twins Lily and Lucas, whispering for their mommy every night. They were only 5 years old, still at the age when a mother's hug equals safety, when her voice equals dreams rather than nightmares. But now their world was broken, and every sunset turned into tears rather than lullabies. Night after night, while the moon rose high and the stars twinkled down like candles at a distance, the twins tossed and turned in their small beds, whispering, crying softly, not willing to let themselves sleep. Now and then, Charles would stand in the doorway, his long body throwing a long shadow across the room, looking at their small bodies tangle up in restlessness. He attempted everything a father might try: soothing music, quiet stories at bedtime, warm milk, even sleeping beside them, until the early light began to seep in. But nothing succeeded. Their little hearts were shattered, and no tale could mend them. He saw the spark in their eyes dim a little more each sleepless night, and that destroyed him in a way that no business failure ever could. This was a man who could seal deals worth millions in a stroke of his pen, who could enter a boardroom and demand respect through mere presence. But here he was, helpless against two little hearts yearning for the one thing he could never provide them with: the love of their mother. And that helplessness gnawed at him every waking moment. He strolled through the grand floors of his mansion, surrounded by costly artwork and lavish furniture, but all of it meant nothing. It all seemed empty. What was the point of affluence when the two people most important to him were drowning in despair? There were nights when he would be walking the floors well past midnight, his fists clutching the handrail of the staircase as if it could keep him from shattering. Some nights he'd stay beside their beds, hearing their whispers, their soft voices shattering his heart bit by bit. He'd pray in silence, hoping somehow his being there would be sufficient to soothe them, but at a deeper level he knew it wasn't. He was not their comfort. He was not their peace. He was merely a man trying so hard to occupy space that only a mother could. And as the nights lengthened and the burden upon his chest intensified, Charles wondered if ever happiness would return to their lives. One very cold night, after the passage of hours spent calming their tears and failing once more, he went into his own room, sat on the side of his bed, and gazed at the black ceiling. His powerful hands, the same hands that had signed documents and wielded authority, now shook as he covered his face. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the faint rustle of wind on the windows and a muffled sob from one of his children, who remained awake. And in this leaden still moment, the man who had everything finally cracked. His voice broke as he prayed into the blackness, an unpracticed, unpolished prayer, but raw and desperate. God, send me someone who can help them, someone who can help us. He didn't know what that help would be. He didn't know whether anyone could ever heal the wound left behind. But for the first time in his life, a man who never had to ask for help said out loud that he could not do this by himself. And little did he know, that prayer whispered in the darkness was going to start something truly amazing, something that would change his children's nights, but something that would forever alter his life. The following morning, at the very moment the first light of dawn poured over the gleaming marble surfaces of the imposing Bennett home, a black SUV turned into the driveway.
Charles had slept little, his brain cycling over that anguished prayer of the previous evening. He hadn't expected to be answered so quickly, but here it was. The agency had sent someone, a replacement nanny. He stood by the door as the car door swung open, and a woman unlike any he'd ever seen in this house emerged. Her name was Grace. She wasn't wearing the flashy designer attire most of the other candidates had arrived in. No high heels, no glittering jewelry, just a plain navy dress, a tidy bun, and an atmosphere of peace that appeared to calm the air itself around her. She was probably in her early 40s, although her face told 1,000 stories of someone who had lived, loved, and lost, but chose kindness every day. Her eyes caught Charles immediately. They weren't scanning the mansion with the wide, greedy curiosity he'd grown accustomed to. She didn't care about the gold-framed paintings or the chandelier dripping with crystals. No, her gaze came immediately to rest on the twins as soon as she entered. And then something shifted. Something so tiny, yet so strong. It caused Charles' throat to constrict. Grace went down to the level of Lily and Lucas, right there on the shiny white floor, to greet them at their height. No pinched smile, no cutesy baby tone, just warmth, just truth. "Hi Lily, hi Lucas," she said softly, her voice like a soft blanket on a winter night. "I'm Grace. I'm here for you." 3 simple words. I'm here for you. And yet, in that moment, it felt like the first crack of light after a long storm. The twins didn't run behind Charles like they usually did when strangers appeared. They didn't cry. They didn't turn away. Lily cocked her head, eyes still puffy from last night's crying, and muttered the softest hi in reply. Lucas nodded sheepishly after her, and for the first time in weeks, Charles felt it, a spark of what he'd almost believed he'd lost for good, hope. He stood there fiddling with his cufflinks, as if to adjust them, but inside, his heart was racing. Could she really be the one to bring peace into their lives? The hours ticked on, and Charles observed Grace with guarded interest. She didn't pepper the twins with questions. She didn't attempt to fill the silence with incessant talk. Instead, she sat on the floor, allowing them to take charge, allowing them to introduce her to their beloved stuffed animals, even though their voices were barely above a whisper. And when Lily had dropped her crayon, Grace didn't simply retrieve it and return it to her. She colored with them, doodling stupid little flowers and suns, making them chuckle softly. Chuckles. Charles had nearly forgotten how that sounded. By nightfall, the house didn't weigh as heavily as it had.
There was a gentleness in the room, a beat to the day that hadn't been there since his wife had died. After supper, a mere meal Grace had insisted on aiding with, she approached Charles, her hands clasped demurely before her. "Mr. Bennett," she told him in her soothing tone, "why don't you retire tonight? I'll take care of bedtime." Charles chuckled, almost. It wasn't a heartless laugh, simply a weary, fractured one. If she only understood the war that lay beyond dusk. "If you can get them to sleep, Grace," he said, his voice heavy with nights of not sleeping, "you'll be a miracle worker." Grace didn't wince. She didn't recede. She simply smiled that gentle smile and said, "Miracles come in quiet ways, Mr. Bennett, quiet ways." He turned those words over in his head as he made his way to his study, a room that had been his sanctuary, his war room, his hiding place for far too many nights. He sat there, glancing at the clock, waiting to hear the sound that he knew would be there. The cries, the whispers, the heartbreak that was an everyday occurrence. But instead, the house was quiet. Not quiet in a creepy manner, silent in a quiet manner. He sat back in his chair, forehead creased. Was it possible? Could it really be possible? He didn't know at the time, but that evening marked the start of something he never expected. The evening a stranger came in with nothing but soft hands and a grace-filled heart, and altered everything. The time passed 9, and Charles sat in his study, gazing blankly at the papers scattered over his desk. The desk lamp threw shadows on the walls, but he wasn't reading a word of them. His thoughts were elsewhere, waiting, expecting the sound that plagued his nights for months. The muffled whimpers, the stifled sobs, the fitful tossing of 2 small hearts, breaking for what they'd lost. Each evening was the same. He'd put them to bed, kiss their forehead, promise things he wasn't certain he could deliver, and then sit, listening, as their weeping slowly dismantled. But tonight was not the same. The stillness went on longer than normal. He checked the clock again, 9:15. Odd. By this time, he must have heard it. The sobbing, the calling for mommy. But what drifted down the corridor instead was something else entirely. A sound so quiet, so unassuming. Charles felt his head jerk up, his heart racing. Not crying, not silent, either. It was music, a hum, a tune that brought warmth to every note, threading its way through the frozen hallways like sunlight bursting through a tempest. It was low and deep, tender and mournful, like honey dripping on stone, soaking into the very crevices of the house. Grief had etched open. Charles carefully pushed back his chair, as if he were frightened to move too quickly, fearing that it would be lost if he did. He moved into the hallway, his shining shoes making barely a whisper on the hardwood floor. And with every step he took toward the twins' room, the music grew louder, rich, calming, vibrant with something he hadn't experienced in so long. Peace. He stood in the doorway and caught his breath. What he saw froze him in place. Grace was there, not standing like most nannies do, not hovering over them, barking orders or fussing with blankets. She was on the floor, cross-legged between the two little beds, her back straight but loose, her presence as peaceful as a still river. The twins were huddled under their blanket, their small faces aglow in the soft light of the lamp, eyes half shut, their breathing slow and regular. But it wasn't the look, though that would have been enough. It was the sound. Grace was singing, and not just singing. She was laying down in that room, something that Charles couldn't articulate, but sensed in every quadrant of his being. Her voice was silky, full-bodied with feeling, bearing words that enveloped those children like the gentle arm of a mother. It wasn't the sing-songy melody of a nursery rhyme. It was richer, older, a lullaby that was born out of the depths of something divine. It had the timbre of love, of hope, like a vow that tomorrow would be kinder than today. Charles leaned on the doorframe, barely breathing, dreading that if he stirred, the instant would break like glass. He shut his eyes for an instant and simply listened. The song was about angels watching through the night, about safety, about love that never lets go, even when the world's empty. And then, just as the melody subsided into a whisper, Grace did something that made Charles's heart thud against his ribs. Something so startling, so unthinkable, that he was rooted where he stood. She extended a hand, taking Lily's small hand in one and Lucas's in the other. Her fingers clasped around theirs with a gentleness words could never describe. And then, she bowed her head, closed her eyes, and started to talk, not to the children, not to herself, but up, beyond. She prayed, a genuine prayer, soft yet strong, each word saturated with genuineness. Not a memorized line, not a mere ritual, but a benediction straight from a heart, convinced of every word it spoke. She whispered safety over them, peace for little minds, courage for their hearts. She spoke life where sorrow had sown darkness. Charles experienced something shattering within him, something he'd held in place, with tight fists and sleepless nights. His throat constricted, his eyes ached, and for the first time in months, he felt tears battering against the walls he'd constructed around his soul. This woman, a stranger mere hours before, was doing something his money, his power, his whole influence could not. She was healing them, not with dramatic gesture, not with pricey toys or therapy slang, but with love, plain, unadulterated, selfless love, the kind that appears quietly and shifts everything, without expecting anything in return. Minutes ticked by, though it seemed time had stood still. Grace's voice trailed off into silence, her hands grasping the twins as their small bodies sank deeper into slumber. Actual sleep, not the restless tossing that had plagued their nights, but quiet, dream-touched rest. Their chests rose and fell in tandem, their features relaxed, free of the darkness that morning had etched beneath their eyes. And in that dark room, Charles glimpsed something he hadn't seen in months. Hope, living, breathing, shining brightly between two small beds, and a woman who bore Grace, not only as her name, but as her very being. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his ears, his eyes watered by unshed tears. He turned before she could catch sight of him, before the feeling on his face gave away the barriers he'd constructed. As he headed for his study, the house felt altered,
not like the empty shell it had been for so long, but as a home again. And for the first time since his wife's death, Charles whispered something that wasn't desperate, wasn't broken, but thankful. Thank you, whoever sent her, thank you. The subsequent nights were nothing short of miraculous. For months, Charles had been living with the echoes of sorrow in the halls, but now it was silenced. No more sobs at midnight. No more little voices calling out for a mother who would never return. Rather, the home could breathe once again. It was slight at first, a laugh here, an outburst there, small footsteps dashing down the hall instead of shuffling down in sorrow. Lily's cheeks were pink again.
Lucas's eyes glittered when he played with his toy cars. For the first time in so long, Charles could see the light again in his children's faces, and along with it came something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. And the children weren't the only ones who noticed the difference. Charles did as well. He found himself standing in the doorway, waiting all day for a glimpse of her, a sight of Grace as she flowed through the house like a silent river, peaceful, steady, feeding everything she touched. She didn't just do well by the twins, she loved them in a way that was unusual and unselfish. When they laughed, she laughed with them. When they cried, she swept them up, her silence and presence more powerful than words. She didn't surround their lives with distraction, no screens, no bottomless toys, but she surrounded it with something deeper: connection, story time on the floor, songs on chore days, little prayers said before meals, and gradually, almost without knowing it, Charles too started to feel lighter. The burden that had lain upon his chest for months grew lighter, replaced by something new and pleasant: peace. One night, just as the warm golden sunset poured across the large windows of the living room, Charles stood by the fire, observing Grace at a distance. The twins were on the floor, building blocks, their laughter echoing through the air like music. Grace sat next to them, her hands lightly on her knees, her smile soft as she heard Lily tell her why her block tower required just one more piece. There was no hurry in her, no restlessness, no indication that she had other places to be. She was completely there, present with them, and for a man who had spent his entire existence being surrounded by individuals who needed something from him, that mere act of standing there seemed remarkable. With the twins at last disappearing into the kitchen for their nighttime snack, Charles cleared his throat and moved in closer. He was not a man who had a problem speaking at company meetings, but this evening he felt unusually reticent. Grace, he started, his voice low, bordering on tentative. She gazed up at him, her eyes warm, and asked him to say something. How do you do it?" he asked, his furrowed brow more serious in tone than he meant to be. "How do you make them feel so safe, so happy?" Grace considered him for a moment, her expression serious, as if balancing the intensity of his inquiry. Then she smiled, not the prepared smile of one offering a courteous response, but a true soft curve of the mouth that reached up to her eyes. "Mr. Bennett," she said quietly, "children don't need rules and routines. They need to feel safe. They must be loved, even when the world is empty." Her words sat suspended in the air like a gentle bell, resonating in the silence, touching places within her she didn't even know were still tender. Charles' throat constricted. Safe, loved, two small words, but with so much force. He remembered the sleepless nights he had spent sitting beside their beds, attempting to calm them with the world's best money could offer. Therapists, toys, gadgets, music machines that promised rest but gave only artificial solace. He had been so intent on solving the issue that he forgot the most basic truth. They didn't need things. They needed someone, a person who could provide them with what his deceased wife had provided so naturally: presence, patience, prayer. Things that weren't available in stores, things that only the heart could give. He looked back over at Grace, observing as she leaned forward to grab a stray crayon from the ground. There was nothing regal about her, no arrogance, no sense of superiority. She was just kind, the sort of kind that doesn't go around advertising itself but turns everything around slowly, like the dawn after a long black night. And for the first time since his wife died, Charles experienced a strange sense of warmth spreading in his chest. Not love, not yet, but something akin to gratitude, something akin to trust. He then understood that this woman had come into his home not only to tend to his children, but to mend something much greater, something in all of them. Towards evening, as the twins fell asleep with grins on their faces, Charles stood by the hallway, hearing Grace hum softly in their room, the same tune that had quieted their sobs the first evening. He rested against the wall, his pockets deep with hands, and allowed the noise to wash over him. And in the silence, with the warm light of the lamp pouring out into the hall and the soft thrum of a lullaby threading through the air, he whispered something he had never allowed himself or anyone else to hear. I can't do this by myself, and perhaps I don't have to anymore. One evening, very late after the sun had fallen behind the hills and colored the sky deep indigo, Charles took a turn down his home's hushed hallway. The house was different now, not oppressive and stifling as it used to be, but warm, vibrant, almost humming with hidden light. He had just concluded a late-night work call, something that once took every ounce of his energy, but now, he walked more slowly, more gently, as if pulled towards something much greater than a corporate negotiation. The soft light of a bedside lamp spilled out into the hallway, and there she stood, Grace, sitting in the creaky rocking chair, a tattered storybook laid out in her hands, her voice a soft flow of music filling the air. She wasn't reading quickly, like one who wanted to mark a box and be done with it. She read slow, careful, each word tumbling from her mouth like magic, creating pictures of castle, courageous hearts, and joyful end. The twins slept huddled beneath the blanket, faces set in soft repose, eyes fluttering as they slept deeper amidst kisses of enchantment. And Charles saw it, the faintest smile on Lily's lips, the quiet rise and fall of Lucas's chest. They weren't grasping at fear anymore. They weren't grasping at something they could never grasp again. They were safe. They were home. Charles was frozen, his hand on the doorframe, his eyes unable to leave. His heart was full of something he couldn't define, a combination of gratitude, wonder, and a soft, bittersweet pain that was almost sacred. He remembered the man he had been mere weeks before, shattered, desperate, flailing in guilt, because all the money in the world couldn't purchase his children's tranquility. He recalled the sleepless nights, the prayers whispered, the oppressive silence that had dwelled in these halls, and now, this quiet miracle unfolding before him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, nearly imperceptible to anyone who didn't know the burden of what had been brought here. But Charles knew. He recognized this was anything but Grace, not the woman herself, but the gift she had brought to their lives. She hadn't arrived on grand platitudes or promises. Patient, love that demanded nothing and gave everything. As Grace closed the book and leaned forward to kiss each little forehead, Charles felt his throat constrict. She said something under her breath then, something so quiet, he nearly didn't hear it, a prayer. 3 or 4 words, a mere blessing or good dream, and a brighter day. And in that instant, Charles remembered something he had lost sight of in his rise to the top, in his pursuit of achievement, in his struggle to keep life together when it came apart. The most precious gifts are not wrapped in gold or stamped with signet. They are in the gentle courage of a heart that decides to care. He slowly turned away, propping himself against the chill of the hallway wall, his eyes brimming with tears he no longer attempted to press. For a moment, he simply stood, hearing the soft groan of the rocking chair, as Grace stood and tucked the twins in for the final time. And then, in the quietness that followed, he spoke into the silence, not to himself, but upward, to the one who had heard a broken man's midnight cry weeks before. Thank you, Lord, he said, his voice rough but resolute, for sending Grace. And he didn't mean only her name. He meant the very thing she represented, the Grace that had returned to this house, the Grace that had mended 2 small hearts, and in the process, was starting to mend him. As he descended back down the hall, the house itself seemed to radiate in the soft light, not with chandeliers and varnished floorboards, but with something intangible but undeniable. A love, true love, the type that makes emptiness laugh, that makes cold walls hug. For the very first time in what seemed like an eternity, Charles smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that went to his heart, because he had learned now that life's most unbelievable miracles are not clothed as luck or power or domination. They arrive softly, on mundane days, in the form of ordinary people who do extraordinary things just because they can. And occasionally, those miracles don't simply heal what's broken, make it beautiful. Occasionally, life reminds us that the things that really heal us aren't wrapped in power or in money. Yet they are wrapped in kindness, the kind that demands nothing and gives everything. Ooh. We all have times when the world is too much, when even the bravest among us can't bear it alone, and in those times it's usually a small act of love, a soft presence, or an open heart to love that restores the light. Tonight's tale is a gentle reminder that what matters most isn't what you have, but who you hold dear and how you love them. So perhaps take the time to be that light for someone, or allow someone to be that light for you. Because in the end, those small moments of grace are what make life beautiful.